Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod. So I thought we'd change it up, Stephen, for the viewers. Last time we were sitting in comfy chairs. This time we're sitting in hard chairs. It's because it's a hard subject.
It's more serious today. It's more serious today, yes. because we have an emergency.
We do. We have an emergency. Captain Mannering, Corporal Fraser's telling Captain Mannering we're doomed. I'm being flippant, but Scottish Government's called a housing emergency. Two questions for you, because you're the politician. Have they called a housing emergency out of political expediency because Labour had tabled a debate which, following the end of the Butte Agreement, they were going to lose, so it was about taking back the initiative from it? That's question number one. And question number two, what's a housing emergency?
So I suppose us political nerds could get ourselves quite worked up about why it happened and about the politics of the Parliament and about numbers and with the SNP going to lose a vote and therefore they got there first. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter, does it? What we do know is that whether it was called by the SNP or whether it was something that was going to be the result of a vote they would have lost, the will of the Parliament is that there's a housing emergency in the country. So whatever way it came about, it is the will of the Parliament and our politicians. But more importantly, to an extent, I suppose, it has been led by the government. So the context has changed since we last spoke about where the political process, where our ministers were, where our politicians were around what those of us that are working in the industry recognise is some form of emergency around housing. And actually, even less important about those in the industry to an extent, it's, as we said in our last podcast when we touched on these things, it's actually something that is really kind of in some shape or form touching every family, whether it's the cost of mortgages, whether it's people not able to go on the housing market, whether it's the lack of affordable housing, whether it's the right kind of renting product for those that are in that need. There is an acute shortage. And that's the bottom line, as well as a whole number of other issues which make it an emergency. What does it mean? You're right. The second question: what does it mean? Well, again, this is the bit that does matter. So if the politics of how we got there doesn't matter, this is the bit that does matter. Until our parliamentarians, primary pressure being on the government because they are the administration governing us, but clearly the responsibility of the opposition as well to define what action needs to be taken to resolve the emergency. So if we've accepted there's an emergency means all-encompassing, so there's nobody debating this is not something that is encompassing the whole housing sector. What does it mean? And nobody's actually given us any answers yet. We've got language of opposition politicians saying the Scottish Government should use every fiscal and political lever at their disposal. We've got the Scottish Government saying, well, look, so should the UK Government because we've had these very significant cuts to both our revenue and capital budget and it needs money. But it's not just about money, of course, as we've rehearsed before. It's also about the draft housing bill and about legislation. So it is about the legislative context as well. But nobody's given us any real answers. But it's a big step forward that they've declared an emergency. And I suppose now the opportunity is for the industry and for others that have a stakeholder interest, including no doubt people that are pressurising the local politicians who are being affected by the housing emergency to help try and shape what comes out of declaring an emergency.
And I think it might be useful for viewers and listeners to get some context around why is it an emergency. Last time I checked, which was a week ago, so it should be up to date, it's about 180,000 people on housing waiting lists. Now, there's always going to be some double counting if you're in big cities like we're sitting in Glasgow. We're in the East End of Glasgow as we speak. So you might be on 3 or 4 housing association waiting lists in the East End of Glasgow, and a proportion of those people on waiting lists are in accommodation and they're just looking for a transfer. And so the numbers were about 170, 180,000 people on the affordable housing waiting list, of which about 40, 50,000 are awaiting a transfer. So in terms of then looking for a property, and I think this is where people get confused. Yes, they now see something that you and I didn't see 40 years ago when we were growing up, which is people sitting begging on the street. But I think people, when they hear a homeless crisis, they think, what is there? I don't see the tented villages everywhere with people living. A lot of homelessness is people just in the wrong type of accommodation or temporary accommodation. They're either in overcrowded accommodation, their families get bigger. So there's about 120,000 people who are not on a transfer list who are actively out there waiting for a property.
So there's homelessness and there's rooflessness.
Yes, yeah. And so that's a big difference. Another thing that's been talked about heavily on this, and you talked about the fiscal levers, is £196 million was cut from the Scottish Government budget to housing associations, which is a big amount of money. But the other way of looking at it is £196 million. Housing associations can borrow sort of a 60-40, so 40% from the government, 60% they go out and borrow. So if you multiply that up, £196 million gives them £500 million. Sounds a lot of money. It's about 3,200 homes. It's not that many. When you've got 100,000 people on the waiting list, 120,000 people on your waiting list, you build 3,200. You still get roughly 120,000 people to 170,000 people on your waiting list. So I suppose the argument is, even if they restored that £196 million in the budget, it's not really going to change anything. So how can they change it? So
if it's an emergency and it's all encompassing, it's everything, right? So if we think of emergencies as we understand them, there's an emergency in our family. We have to get a child to hospital. Yeah. Everything's dropped, and we get into an ambulance or our car, and we get to hospital. And very quickly, you might wait at A&E, but very quickly there'll be an assessment done as to whether this, is on a trolley straight into operating theatre or whatever form of the outcome of triage is. So, and we think of the COVID pandemic. And it was an emergency that stopped everything. We had a national state of emergency in the country, something we never lived through before in our life, and perhaps never will be. So, the use of the word is quite significant. So there's the budgets from the Scottish Government towards social and affordable housing. There is the legislative framework that has adversely affected the rights or wrongs of the debate. In one sense, irrelevant. Everybody in the property and investment industry tells us that the proposed draft housing bill has killed an element of the industry stone dead. We have the private sector for sale market drawn to, almost a close, with shutters coming down in many sites because of the issues around borrowing requirements, the cost of building, the mortgage rates, a whole number of things. And all of that is contributing to exacerbating what has long been identified in this country by both governments, by councils, by all political parties, is a significant shortfall in housing that the country needs in all sectors. So, that's not something that's new. That bit's being debated, but some of these factors I've mentioned are contributing now to making an emergency. So that's on simply the straightforward housing side. But we've also got a whole number of other factors, which is part of our general economic challenge in the country. Inflationary costs, cost of materials, cost of importing because of Brexit, tariff charges and all of these things and all of that paperwork.
Reading the stat, at Brexit time, 68% of our building materials are imported.
Yeah, fact. Yeah, right. So we can't argue with facts. We might argue about the politics of all these things, and we've all got our own personal views, but these are facts. And then there is a problem facing every industry in the country, public and private sector. We have a shortage of labour. We have an ageing population. In fact, there's another issue around the housing. What we're doing for housing all of us later and older in life and with particular needs, because we have a ticking time bomb in terms of our ageing population. So you see how this all becomes a huge emergency, because it's not just about supply and demand of housing. It's not just about budgets. It's about all these other things as well. So there's a general election coming. And, if I were advising perhaps the SNP, I would say put this at the top of the general election agenda in Scotland. Here's a reason to vote SNP, because we are going to make sure that we all know it's an incoming Labour government are going to have to address this as this all-round emergency. And some of these factors are about our labour supply. We need to have a debate about how we get more labour into this country and the right kind. We need labour of all sorts, skilled, unskilled professionals and the like. If it were the Labour Party, because it's so all-encompassing, you want to win the whole UK election, should it not be an absolute top priority as well? So the election is an opportunity to help shape the debate. The declaration of the Parliament is an opportunity to help shape the debate. But see how complex it is, because it's so all-encompassing. There's no short-term fixes to this. Absolutely none. But there are some immediate interventions that could be made that will begin to alleviate some of the very acute symptoms that we're facing. So certainly a relook at the budgets, like the social the housing budget. They got the huge cut. A debate about where did that money go? Is it coincidental that almost the same amount of money is in the active travel budget? Are bike lanes really a priority, or getting people into the houses they need at the moment? This is a debate that the government and the Parliament need to have. The housing bill, as a matter of urgency, if you want to reinstate Scotland as a place to invest, has to be redrafted sooner rather than later. And we need to be confident that the Parliament will support a moderated bill that, yes, wants to achieve the very worthy ambitions around protection for renters and getting rogue landlords out of the system. But we can't get rogue landlords out of the system and throw the whole PRS market out and indeed affecting wider investment in housing, because people are just saying, particularly south of the border, look, Scotland's not a place to invest in just now, because they're kind of all over the place and they're sending out the wrong signals. So these are some immediate things that could happen, whilst you're looking at that big, broader debate about these issues that our country needs to take long-term decisions about. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be back at emergency after emergency and a whole number of fronts, whether it's cost issues, whether it's labour supply, or any of these wider things. Big issues.
Well, I was in the last week. We on Radio Scotland we were talking about and the housing emergency, and people were phoning up with ideas. So I've not run any of these passes. I'm going to throw some of the ideas that members of the public said, and a couple of people came up with this one, which was, do not allow anybody to own. And interestingly, a couple of people said the same number. Do not allow anybody to own more than 5 properties. And that would solve the housing crisis. What's your thoughts on that? I have my own opinion on that. So what's your thoughts?
Well, look, you can understand why people would argue that. You can understand it from a frustration point of view. I can even understand the principle of whether people need to own that number of properties. And I think that's all a fair debate. But frankly, even if you introduce that as a law tomorrow, it's not even a drop in the ocean to addressing the scale of the crises that the country faces in terms of shortfall of housing. I mean, it in itself, it would need to be one of like 3,000 measures that are similar to start tackling the issue. But the scale of the challenge is such that we need major lever interventions. Whether that be in terms of public sector finance or private sector finance, but we just need that general boost and growth to the economy again that solves all those wider issues as well about labour supply and costs as well.
To give some context to listeners, in terms of that, about 90% of private landlords in Scotland own one property.
Yeah.
So that's that. Next one.
And even if you outlawed that for some reason, I mean, what is that going to put into the marketplace for people at the moment? It's not going to solve the crisis.
So next And about 12% of the housing stock in Scotland is private rented. So I suppose the argument would be all these landlords would have to give their houses up, and that would flood the market with 12%. You know, if you said no private landlords, that would then reach 12% of properties. So there's about 2.5 million residential properties in Scotland. So because I can't do 12% very quickly, but I can do 10%, that's about 250,000 houses would flood on. We sell about 100,000 properties a year in Scotland. So that's 2.5 years worth of supply comes on in a winner, would be the theory behind it. So that would suppress house prices because you get 2.5 years of supply on top of your current year of supply. So you get 3.5 years of supply in one go hitting the market. My thoughts on that is 60% of the housing market is privately owned. So 60% of the population are going to be pretty pissed off at that. Because what you're effectively saying is we're going to solve the housing crisis by deflating house prices across the board. Actually, what it would do, my perception is the private rented sector isn't 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 pound houses. The private rented sector in general tends to be, I'm generalising, properties below about 150 grand. So what you'd actually do is the people who do own their properties in that price band, who without sounding patronising or condescending are probably not the wealthiest part of the population, you're actually going to give all of them negative equity and destroy them. So that would be a bit of an issue.
Well, we've learned in recent years, haven't we, that if you try to intervene in the marketplace without taking the marketplace with you on a journey, that what we do is we actually end up disrupting the whole economy. So the Liz Truss experience when she took over as Prime Minister in that initial budget, just caused chaos within the pension market. So whatever the rights and wrongs of what she was trying to achieve and our Chancellor were trying to achieve, you can't just do that. We can't disrupt the marketplace in that way, because the consequences would be to exacerbate the housing crisis. But there are immediate tools that can be done that we've spoken about reprofiling budgets and about legislative certainty and certainty around the position around rent control zones or whatever. There's effectively there's a new administration, a new First Minister and Deputy First Minister. They have an opportunity to bring the programme for government forward and reset under the new First Minister, First Ministerial administration and team to reset the political priorities of the administration. And that was done quickly and tackled the housing bill and gave us meat in the bones about what the housing emergency would. I think that would raise some eyes and get a feeling that this has been given a significant priority by the new political team. And as I said, we have a general election looming. We have a whole, the people like the big institutional investors, they're essentially mainly venture capitalists and pension funds are out there, and they could easily be brought in to help with private finance going into some of the public sector element. We have huge swathes of public sector land in the country. We're not short of tools at our disposal, those levers that politicians like to talk about. We're not short of them. We just need somebody to be giving them so much and immediate attention. And maybe the housing minister should be released from the detail of this very controversial housing bill to go and do some, for want of a better description, a bit of donkey work around these levers and give the cabinet proposals, or maybe our opposition politicians could, although it's always tempting, and I understand this, for opposition politicians to let the government do its own digging and see what happens.
And wait to never interrupt your opponent when he's in the middle of making a mistake.
Well, you get that. And again, we live in the real world about how politics works, but we are getting close to the general election. And south of the border, the UK Labour Party are putting some very interesting proposals on the table. Redesignating out the green belt as a grey belt, insisting on 50 50% affordable housing in these developments. We've had a recent new National Planning Act, NPF4, and a lot of people have concerns about it and criticisms, but there's a lot of good things in it. And if you're looking at places like Glasgow, where they're, a priority under the NPF4, the new national planning framework that we've all got to operate under, and the new planning local developments that govern the planning process, and local councils will have to reflect as they review these plans to come in line with NPF4 very, very shortly. It's given a great priority to brownfield development, and that's great news. And Glasgow's rising to that challenge. We're re-looking at its flexibility around the height of buildings, which has always been something that's been controversial in a city with a skyline and Victorian heritage we do, but recognising that the world's changed, both in terms of a housing emergency, but our climate emergency. So sustainable development for building means we have to think differently. So look, there are a lot of positive things going on. We just kind of need to, again, let's use the words that the politicians like, turbocharge these things now, kind of we have a kind of, I really said a Joe Biden turbocharge, because it was one of the first person I heard saying it, and it was something of a contradiction of ideas of Joe Biden turbocharging anything, but our politicians are not 80-year-old, whether they're in, whichever one of our main parties in Scotland. So I think they could turbocharge some things, and the fact that we have this emergency declared, which is very different from the last time we spoke about the political and national context to where housing is. The fact we have it all that declared gives an opportunity, and really, I suppose, to those of us that are working and supporting people in the general housing and property and land industry, the challenge is to our side of the table as well. Is especially we strongly believe in the free market. What you want to sit back and say the government's got to do everything. Come on, get your ideas on the table, get engaged, see this as an opportunity, and let's hope it is a blank piece of paper. Let's help make it a blank piece of paper, but populate that blank piece of paper with solutions, and take part in that. And let's leave all of the criticism and the moaning that's been going on for so long behind, because the context has changed to give us an opportunity, both with the Scottish housing emergency being declared and because there is a UK general election looming, and the main opposition party, the Labour Party, looking set to win that election, has put housing and started to flesh out its proposals around housing on the table. So I think time for the industry to do a wee bit less moaning and finger pointing, and come on, rise to the challenge and try and influence that direction of travel, both at UK level and Scottish level, as well as our local councils. They have a key role to play as well.
Because you mentioned about public land, right? And I always remember, so again, for the listeners and viewers, we're in the East End of Glasgow, and this is East End of Glasgow, I feel really comfortable. I'm not from the East End of Glasgow. It's the first office I ran when I worked in the estate agency was in the East End of Glasgow, and I always felt that people were really honest. My prejudices come out here. When I used to go to the West End, I used to think people were just barely tolerating this white sock salesman in their house. Whereas the East End of Glasgow is like, great, you're going to come and help me reach the goal that I'm wanting to achieve here. And I always remember there's a bit of land, I can still see it, not when, I don't live in East End of Glasgow, but where I drive, because of where it is in Glasgow, when I cover a certain hill, I can still see this bit of land. So to give people context, 30 years ago, I start running the Denniston office of the company I work for. And I go to this bit where the street's there, the pavements are there, the street lights are there, the street lights go on and off. But the tenements don't exist there anymore. And based on my memory of stuff, the tenements would have been bulldozed about 20 years earlier. Because I remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. 20 years on, it's like this bit of land that time's forgotten. The street's still there, the pavement's still there, and the street lights still go on and off, but the houses are long gone. So that was nearly 30 years ago. That bit of land is still there with the streets, the pavement, the lampposts in it. And there's still no housing on that land. So I'm quite sure people listening to this in Dundee and Aberdeen and Inverness and Edinburgh and Kilmarnock and Ayr will think of bits of land like that are patently within governmental stroke local authority control. And I remember business that I was doing about 10, 12 years ago, there always seemed to be this logjam of, well, we can't do anything with it, because to do something with it, we've got this convoluted process to go through to demonstrate that we got best value in utilising this land. So as a consequence, nothing seemed to happen.
Well, but there's another intervention that the Scottish Parliament can make to free up the regulation around that convoluted process about how you get land into the marketplace and about how quickly you can do it. There's other things as well that could be done. I don't think it would take legislative change or stand to be corrected by people that understand these things better than I do. But if we think of pieces of land like that and that wider brownfield agenda we're speaking about this so highly prioritised by NPF4, then why can we not have a presumption in favour of development to fast track the planning process with the right safeguards in place? Because I never mentioned it earlier, but part of this whole housing emergency is the scale of challenge inside planning departments who are so tightly resourced in post austerity, and lots of people experience leaving, as has happened in the private sector, but particularly acute in the public sector is another aspect. So look, there's tons can be done. And hopefully the context of a housing emergency empowers the industry to make sure that we don't let our politicians off the hook for just declaring an emergency and feeling good about it, but we actually make sure that they're pushed into some action. And there are things they could do that don't necessarily cost money, but would enable the private sector to play its role where it can in the housing emergency.
And I often think, and I know it doesn't sound like a great way to be thinking, but I often think in terms of, so again, I look at the average house price. When I bought my first flat, the average house price in Scotland, and we've always, without jumping around in my conversation here, regularly when I'm on Radio Scotland and we're preparing for going on, and I'll look at the research, and there's maybe been some stuff in the news, so I'm ready for maybe being asked about this, about the average UK house price. And I always talk about the UK is so huge, and the London economy so skews everything about the UK that don't pay attention to the average UK. Plus, in relation to housing, the average house price in Scotland is about 100 grand less than the average house price UK-wide. That we are actually fortunate. When we talk about a housing crisis in Scotland, we're really fortunate. When we had John Boughton on the podcast talking about we're not building enough affordable housing in Scotland at 12,000 units in a year, and yet in England, which is 10 times the size of Scotland, they only built 8,000. I mean, they should be building 120,000 to be on a par with Scotland. The average house price in Scotland is about £190,000, which is 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, somewhere in that region times average earnings. When I bought my first property 26 years ago, it was 3.6 times average earnings. And so part of my concern when I look at how do we get in a better place is it's not just about the housing market. Part of the problem is average earnings, if they kept up with inflation in the last 15 years, would be about £6,000 higher than they are just now. Average earnings in Scotland are almost half average earnings in Denmark, for example. And so part of me, I tend to be an optimist for things, part of me in my more depressed positions think, but the problem here is we could fiddle about with some money. As I demonstrated, we could get an extra 200 million quid and build an extra 3,500 houses. Doesn't really change anything. The issue is we need to fix the wider economy because we need people to be earning more money. Because if people are earning more money, then there's more money going through the exchequer, and this is where
and then there's more money for house building and the social and affordable sector and all these things. And I mean, you're right to talk about the huge differential in house prices across the country, and that is a contributory factor to this wider economic challenge that we have as a country. But actually, the bigger issue at the moment for me, in terms of supply of houses and about the general housing market, is that the build costs are the same. the building costs have went through the roof because we're not just living through a cost of living crisis, but a cost of doing business crisis. And look, in many ways, the disparity in house prices kind of helps us and kind of try to turbocharge, if you like, all aspects of this emergency, because it's more attractive for employers who want to create, for example, when Barclays came to Glasgow and other emerging industries, and not just in financial services, but the emerging tech sector there is in Glasgow. An attraction is the quality of postgraduates and availability of them coming out of our superb universities, but it's also about the fact that house prices are not as expensive in other parts of the country, therefore cost of living and about just the general way of life. So we could have some interventions that could turbocharge, we could take advantage of the skewed market that helps places like Scotland. I mean, I'm using Glasgow as an example because it is the biggest city in Scotland, but all of this applies in different scales to other parts of the country. As to say, NPF4 and all these other are opportunities as well as the housing emergency. In fact, I spoke about the presumption, turbocharging the presumption in favour of development in these brownfield sites. We could have permitted development rights. We could create zones where people know, and maybe we could have tax incentives for those. There's so much could be done that actually I'm hoping, I'm an optimist like you, that the declaration of this emergency, the looming general election, the wider issues around the economy that you've just highlighted, another aspect of it so well there, is a big opportunity for us to try and fix some of these things.
Un-PC way of looking at things comes in. I always then think, right, okay, what did despot dictatorships do when they get in and they want everybody to have that initial feel good that this guy's a good guy? They build stuff.
Yeah.
And why? Well, 6% of 6.5%, I think it is, of the Scottish workforce work in construction, and about a third of them are self-employed. So we've already got a reasonable, that as a standalone part of the economy is a reasonable bit. £1 spent, every £1 spent in construction adds £2.92 to GDP. And then every house that you build generates 2.2 jobs, full-time jobs. So I look at housing and think, this is a win-win for politicians to pump money. If you can pull as many levers as possible here and get in, you're immediately, for every pound you chuck in, you're adding nearly £3 to the general wider economy. So that's helping things. Every house you're getting built is creating 2.2 full-time jobs. Wow. First thing I'd do if I got into power is do whatever I could to be building some housing. It's not like you're doing what China's doing and building housing that isn't needed. You're building housing that's needed. But secondly, you're giving that capital boost. You're giving that boost, that leg up to the economy by spending it here for the boost to come out at the other end at 3 times the size, and then you're creating all these jobs. And effectively, what I would be looking at it if I'm building housing is, and I'd be sitting down with the financial institutions, the pension houses. I mean, we are hopefully going to have a guest on the podcast who takes that institutional investment on the private build-to-rent sector to be building properties at the Scottish Property Federation annual conference. There was a lot of talk about there is institutional money desperate to come in. If you can do whatever you can, tax breaks to get people to build, make use of it, as I often point out, 96% of Scotland's empty, 2%'s urban, 2%'s urban green, golf courses, parks. If you could just give us all a wee bit more land, spread us all out a wee bit, might feel a wee bit more healthy, more people in work. I look at construction as well. Construction, again, as a non-political person, I think, how brilliant is construction? Because construction's not IT, and I'm not decrying IT, but everybody needs to be qualified in IT to work in IT. Construction has got unskilled labour through to very skilled labour.
That's a highly specialised labour, and then the spin-offs for all the so-called white-collar professional roles that support them. But here's the thing. what all of this does is important for the economy, is important for reputation, institutional investment, for how we feel and all the rest of it. But here's the most important thing. Who's going to benefit from all this? The wider punters, the politicians' customers, their voters. People get new houses. People get a standard of housing that they will love, that they deserve. They'll get them to a sustainable and energy efficient standard that that much of a traditional housing doesn't. People will be in employment. There'll be apprenticeships. People will be spending money. Then they spin off to where they spend the money. So
is it better quality housing? So the drain on the NHS.
All of this.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it's about people. So look, I think we started with what we thought was a difficult question at the beginning of this podcast about what is actually. I mean, it's all worthy. What does this mean about housing emergency? Well, we've talked it through, and I actually think we've come up with some. If I say so myself, some damn good ideas. I think we can look forward to the invite in to give some advice to those that are actually decision makers. Yes. And if we don't get an invite in, because I'm not really worried about that, we're all busy people. Then I hope at least some of those influencers, both in the government and those that influence in the wider parliament, but also in the industry, might have listened to some of this today, and we might have just reinforced some of the ideas that are already there, or provided some other thoughts about what actually an emergency means in terms of the action that might solve some of it.
Good. I was about to wind up, but a question just came into my head that I'm going to ask you, since you are a politician of a party that was against this and then in favour of it. Another question that people raised: right to buy. I'm probably asking you, it's going to take a 20-minute answer, require a 20-minute answer. Right to buy, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Has it been the cause of this housing crisis, or was it the right thing, just done a wee bit wrong, that's contributed to the housing crisis, or it's like just part of that, it was nothing to do with it?
Well, I think the problem was that, like lots of things that are done by politicians and by the public sector, is done in isolation. So, who could quibble with the right of people that have paid rent for, decades in some occasions, to be able to benefit from that in some shape or form? And that was part of the motivation for right to buy. But at the same time, there was not. We did, of course, it created a shortage because you weren't filling the supply and demand. The demand didn't go away because people had the right to buy their existing properties. The demand continued with others and other generations, but we weren't contributing to supply. So I suppose it's a wee mini example of this great big wide emergency we have now. And the lesson to be learned is, can we look at this as a holistic emergency with all the acute symptoms and with the longer term solutions to make sure that we don't create another emergency, either in one of the parts of the sector, like you can argue right to buy did, or where we are now in the whole sector.
So in other words, whatever they do, and obviously the malevolent dictatorship that we are going to employ that's going to run the country from now on, make sure you think through all the unintended consequences of what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we will have more along soon. I'll let the listeners in a wee secret. The reason we recorded this is because we were expecting somebody else on today who unfortunately couldn't make it. So we hope you enjoyed this edition. We've got some great guests lined up, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you by the Wright Business Centre. Located just off the M8 in Glasgow, we have office space to suit all companies from the smallest startup to a large corporate business. Wright Business Centre also provides virtual office services like mail handling, creating a seamless virtual operation for remote teams or startups. Whatever your business needs, go to wrightbusinesscentre.co.uk.
Welcome to the world of hassle-free property management with Indigo Square. As a premier residential lettings and property factoring service, we pride ourselves on tailoring our services to meet the unique needs of each client. Whether you're a landlord seeking a professional agent to handle the complexities of new legislation, or a homeowner in a shared building looking for seamless repair solutions, Indigo Square has got you covered. Say goodbye to stress and hello to peace of mind with Indigo Square. To discover how we can simplify your property management experience, visit our website at www.indigolits.com or drop us a line at info@indigolits.com. Your property deserves the best. Choose Indigo Square.
Introducing 2010 Land Consultancy, a dynamic and specialized team of experts dedicated to navigating the complex world of public affairs, planning consultancy, and business development. Based in Glasgow and serving clients across the UK and beyond, our agile team offers unparalleled expertise to public, private, and civil society organizations. With a strong network of connections in Scotland and beyond, Stephen brings invaluable insights and strategic guidance to every project. So choose 2010 Land Consultancy for innovative solutions, unparalleled expertise, and a commitment to driving success for our clients.